If you're involved in aviation, it's important to know what the rules are. Unfortunately, the FAA keeps changing those rules over and over and over. Sometimes they even redefine a word that you would think is obvious. Lucky for you, Pat and I are here to fill in the gaps and explain all that because there was just a series of rule changes for December 2024 that you're going to want to know about. Mr. Brown, one of the things, well, two things. There is a rule in that's, well, I was going to say it's unwritten, but it is written. It's just not written by the FAA. Should at any time you start to understand the FARs, there's a problem. And of course, part of the reason for that is they're in constant change. And just this month, December 2024, there are some new changes in the FARs that are worth knowing about, even if you think these are minor. They're actually not. And one of the weird ones, I really like this, at long last, after 66 years, the FAA has been in business. They have defined the word passenger.
Yes, they have. It's interesting because if you look at 61.1 in one of my favorite books, if you look at 61.1, there's a whole bunch of definitions, cross country time and all kinds of stuff like that. But nowhere does it define what a passenger is. And so they've added a line that said, and I'll quote it, I'm looking at my cheat sheet here. Passenger means any person on board an aircraft other than a crew member, FAA personnel, manufacturer personnel required for type certification, or a person receiving or providing flight training, checking, or testing as authorized by this part. So the interesting thing about that is that the um, that this is now clearly saying that CFIs are not and students are not passengers of one another. And there have been several interpretations over the years that have said that that's not the that is the case, that they're not passengers of one another. But all three of those interpretations, the Kortokrax, Olshock, and Schaffner interps, those were rescinded back in 20, I think it was July, but in 2023, those were rescinded because there was no regulatory basis upon which to rest those interpretations. In other words, they were wrong interpretations. This fixes that. So it very clearly says that for the purpose of 61.1, that CFI and student are not passengers to one another.
I love that. You gave a great definition. You gave me a great, you elucidated on it. I think that's a word, and gave me a good sense of what we're talking about. But what I find very entertaining is along the same lines. At the same time, the FAA made that change to define what passengers is. They removed the word from 6157, where it used to say passengers, and now they say persons. Would you like to
Yeah.
get into that a little bit?
Well, first of all, I think the word that you're looking for was hallucinated, not elucidated, but or perhaps.
You may be correct. Yes.
Yeah, in the old 6157 A and B, and by the way, so you don't have to go looking it up. That was the one that talks about the three takeoffs and landings the preceding 90 days a day, and that's the A. And B is the night part that talks about the 1 hour after sunset and 1 hour before sunrise. So 6157A and B talk about the recency of experience in terms of the 90-day takeoffs and landings. And where it used to say, and again, I'm reading from my cheat sheet here, except as provided in paragraph E of this section, no person may act as a pilot in command of an aircraft carrying passengers or an aircraft certificated, blah, 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 in the 90 days. And the new one says that, again, except provided in paragraph E, no person may act as a pilot in command of an aircraft carrying persons or an aircraft certificated, blah, 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 blah. And it carries the same wording through 6157B, which is the night currency, and now it changes passengers to persons. So, so that's kind of that's kind of a big deal.
And I suspect that's because, in redefining passenger and using persons, um, I might go on a flight and I'm wondering, what can I do? I've got my CFI and I'm the student, or I'm a pilot who's getting training for something. And I have to wonder, can I log PIC on this? Because I'm actually not current right now. That's another part of 6157. I'm not night current. I come to you and say, Pat, let's just go do 3 around the pattern. I don't want to do it alone. And I have to caution people. I have known people who haven't flown at night in years and figure I'll
Right.
save the money on the CFI by just doing it myself.
Right.
Don't do that. You could get lost before you're on downwind.
You
but
know
I
that's true. Yeah,
but
that's true. But to your point, now because a CFI and a certificated pilot are not passengers to one another, then the certificated pilot can log PIC time, regaining his or her night currency with the CFI on board because the CFI is not a passenger, according to the new definition of passenger. So
I
yeah,
suspect that's something a lot of people actually got wrong in their logbooks prior to this, where they thought they were PIC, but now there's an actual delineation of it. While I'm going flying with you, I'm not night current, but you're helping me get night current with the safety of having a CFI. I can now log PIC time for that flight, and that's kind of a neat thing because now we're kind of accepting to the FAA that beyond the primary training or doing a flight review, there are times when it makes absolute sense for a CFI to go flying with somebody who's not in search of a rating. They just
yeah,
need to get some training on something that maybe they feel weak on.
yeah. So if you look at the new the new wording, and by the way, we can put the links to all of these regs that we're talking about in the show notes
Oh,
session
that
or
seems
in the
excessive,
section.
Pat. I mean, people would have
Yeah.
to read. That's why we
Well,
have
I
you.
think but it's important. So
Yes, it is.
we will put those things in the notes so that you can actually click on them and go and see the actual regs. But again, I hate death by PowerPoint, but this is really important. So let me just kind of read it. 6157E um, has added a paragraph, subparagraph 5, and that basically says um, that paragraphs A and B, which is your day and night currency of this section, do not apply to a person receiving flight training from an authorized instructor, provided, number one, flight training is limited to the purpose of meeting the requirements of paragraph A and B of this section. Again, A and B, the currency for day and night. Notwithstanding the provisions of paragraph A and B of this section, the person receiving flight training meets all other requirements to act as PIC of the aircraft. In other words, your flight review, you have your medical or whatever you're using for the medical. Uh, and number three, the authorized instructor and the person receiving flight training are the sole occupants of the aircraft. So you can't throw your buddy Joe or Josephine in the back seat and go regain your currency with a CFI in the front seat if you're not current, because now you've got a passenger, and it says specifically in the other sections you can't carry passengers if you're not day or night current.
That makes all the sense in the world, though, because it now makes that is specifically a flight training experience. It's not a pleasure ride with your buddies. You're not taking your
Exactly.
spouse or your best friend with you. This is just an instructional flight, and you'll focus on the flight and the instruction, not, hey, look at the sights.
Yeah.
I think this
Yeah.
is a good change.
So in plain English, a pilot who's otherwise current, again, a flight review, your medical, all of that stuff, may now log PIC time if the flight is to regain night currency and the pilot and the CFI are the only ones on board. So, and then they've added paragraph 6 that says paragraphs A and B of this section, again, the day and night currency of this section, do not apply to the examiner or the applicant during a practical test required by this part. So that's a bit of a change too. Now, for those of you that might want to go and look at this multi-hundred page notice of proposed rulemaking, we'll put that link to the notice in the notes as well. But if you're kind of wondering where how we're kind of coming to where we're coming from, especially with regard to this thing that we're talking about here, look at section 4, subsection F. And if you read that, it will tell you that neither the CFI or the student need to meet the currency requirements of A and B if the student is a certificated private pilot and not a student pilot. I mean, a real for real student pilot. If because if you read a little bit further down in that same section, here's the actual wording that kind of excludes a student pilot from this. And here's the wording. If the same flight instructor were to act as PIC of an aircraft carrying a flight student who is not an otherwise qualified pilot, the risk is increased because in the event of an emergency, only one person is capable of operating the aircraft rather than two, and the sole person capable of operating does not have the benefit of recent flight experience. In other words, certain proficiencies may have degraded over time due to disuse. In the previous paragraph, it was clear to say that while both pilots may not meet the recency experience, because you have a CFI on board and a qualified pilot, that is private commercial instrument, what have you, on board, the risk is reduced because you've got two qualified pilots on board as opposed to the student pilot, I mean, a real student pilot certificate who is not, according to this, a qualified pilot. So, it may seem like it's kind of splitting hairs, and I suppose in some sense it is, but what it does is it actually codifies what what was the name of that one, the Kortokrax, Olshak, and Schaffner interpretations tried to I guess try to interpret that in fact the CFI is not a passenger in the airplane. But according to the FAA, if you look through the NPRM and look through the FAA's reasonings, there was never anything in the actual FARs that said, and I quote, the CFI is not a passenger. There's nothing in the FARs that said that until now. And this is, as you said, Jamie, 100 years or something like that into it. We're finally defining passenger.
Well, and this is just conjecture on my part, but I wonder how much of this stemmed from the age-old debate: is an instructional flight a commercial operation or not? Because
Yeah.
you are paying for it, but as you say, the CFI is not a passenger; they are a required crew member. So it
Yeah.
becomes an interesting question that has created some issues in the past. But since we're talking about instructional flights and changes and definitions, it might surprise people, especially people who are on their way to getting a CFI or who are a CFI, certificated flight instructor. What
Yeah.
does that actually mean? What are you allowed to do? And believe it or not, that was always not always clearly expressed in the FARs. And now I believe it's 61.193, 61.193. They have clarified what is that.
You're stealing my thunder, Jamie. I'm the one that's supposed to know the numbers here. Come
Well,
on.
I need to look a little smart every once in a while. I just need to look like I have a half an idea what I'm doing. Then I can pass it on over to you to really put the gold leaf on everything and make it look pretty.
Well, I would say that most of the time you do have about a half an idea about what you're talking about. So we're on the same page there. So
Perfect.
anyway, so in order to understand this, we have to go back to what the old wording was, and that old wording is still in this 2024 book, and it may well be in the ones that say 2025, because if you find a 2025 book that was printed some months ago, some of these changes may not be in there. But I digress. So the old wording in 193A said, and I'm reading this: a person who holds a flight instructor certificate is authorized within the limitation of that person's flight instructor certificate and ratings to train and issue endorsement that to train and issue endorsements that are required for, and then it lists 9 very specific things. The new wording is almost identical, but it says a person who holds a flight instructor certificate is authorized within the limitations of that person's flight instructor certificate and ratings to conduct ground training, flight training, certain checking events, and to issue endorsements related to, and again, it lists the same 9 things. So what it's done essentially is to incorporate in the regs the things that we all do on a regular basis anyway. Aircraft checkouts. Let's say, Jamie, let's say you've got a bunch of time in a Mooney and I buy a Mooney and I call you, Jamie, can you check me out in this Mooney? Well, according to the old definition or the old rule, it that may be a little gray, but it
Mhm.
isn't anymore. Um, and in that list of 9 things, number 7 used to say, this is in that list of 9 things. Now, number 7 used to say a flight review, operating privilege, or recency of experience requirement of this part. Now, the new number 7 says a flight review, operating privilege, or recency of experience requirement of this part, or training to maintain or improve the skills of the certificated pilot.
That's so
So,
important because type specific training in any aircraft of any horsepower rating, it really is important. Sometimes people will just say, well, I'll go from this one to that one. There can be profound differences between aircraft that look relatively similar. So making
right.
that change means now not only is the CFI comfortable giving the instruction, I'm now realizing, oh, that's probably a good idea because it's actually in the regs.
Yeah. So they didn't stop there. So in 61 193, there is a brand new subsection, C Charlie. And here's what it says: the privileges authorized in this section do not permit a person who holds a flight instructor certificate to conduct operations that would otherwise require an air carrier or operating certificate or specific authorization from the administrator. So what they're attempting to do here is recognize that there's perhaps some gray areas that in the past some flight instructors may have been tempted to engage in that really weren't kosher.
I actually do have a friend who ran afoul of this, and it's 30 years ago, but flight instructor. And there was a thing, and I think they still refer to it as a 134 and a half operation instead of a 135. But what would happen is somebody would come to the flight school and say, hey, I want to go to Key West. Can you guys fly me? Well, no, that would
Yeah,
be an illegal flight. But if we call it a flight lesson, we could. And it's like, no, nobody's buying that. Like your
yeah,
first lesson is a long cross country to a destination where you're getting out.
yeah, yeah. Exactly.
That's
Not
what
coming
this
back.
is.
Yeah,
This is a
yeah,
wordy way of saying, just do what you're supposed to do. Don't go off on this
yeah.
tangent saying, yeah, I could earn money in additional ways. No, you're not a charter operation.
So, along these same lines, the FAA did not forget about sport pilots because in 61413, which covers sport pilot privileges, they've expanded 413A, which read identically to 193A. They have expanded 413A now to include conduct ground training, flight training, certain checking events, and to issue endorsements related to, and basically the same 9 things are listed. Um, they Number 6, however, on that list used to say a flight review or operating privilege for a sport pilot. And they've changed the wording now on number 6 to say a flight review or operating privileges for a sport pilot or training to maintain or improve the skills of a sport pilot. So again, That's a significant change that, on the surface may not seem like such a big deal, but really that's a significant change. And then in 413, 413, they also added another subsection C, all new. And this is the one that talks about the privileges authorized in this section do not permit a person who holds a flight instructor certificate with a sport pilot rating to conduct operations that would otherwise require an air carrier or operating certificate for specific authorization or specific authorization from the administrator. So it's the same paragraph, the same wording put into the sport pilot reg as it is the other reg. So again, they're just trying to make sure that your friend doesn't fly somebody down to Key West and drop them off and say, "Oh, by the way, let me sign your logbook. We'll call this dual."
Yeah. No, that ain't
So,
happening.
you know, all of these changes took effect December the 2nd. So it's been several weeks by the time this airs. It's been several weeks. Um, and really, the bottom line here, Jamie, is that effective in December of 2024, and we're recording this actually on December the 5th. Um, uh, some big changes happened, including the flight instructor recency of experience thing. And let me just tell you, just very briefly, yesterday, I went through the renewal of my CFI. I don't have the temporary certificate right in front of me, but I went through the renewal of my own CFI, which now does not have an expiration date on it. I will get a new card because my old card had an expiration date. But the next one that comes in the mail in the next 6 or 7 weeks is the last CFI certificate I will ever get in the mail. And now I have to keep up with the recency of experience, which for practical purposes is still the expiration date. What
Mhm.
I don't know is because I renewed it in December, does my recency of experience end date, REED, does my recency of experience end date, is it now the end of December? Or is it the end of January, which it could be as long as I renew within 3 months, 3 calendar months of the month it's due to renew in.
Mhm.
Theoretically, my receive experience end date should still be the end of January, which is what my current expiration date is. So, assuming that's the case, then my new expiration date, which is the recency of experience end date now, uh, will be January 31st, 2027, assuming that they renew it as of January as opposed to as of December, because I'm within that 3 month period of time. So I'm not even sure about that. So the only way that I can make sure of that is to, in about another couple of months, I'll call Airman CERT in Oklahoma City and I'll ask them, what do you show as my recency of experience in date? And then on the back of my CFI card, when I get it, I'm going to put a little, one of those little indelible markers, and I'm going to mark January 31st, if that's the right one, 2027, put a piece of scotch tape over it. And that's going to be my reminder that I've got to go through one of the several ways that I can renew my CFI, either the wings credit. Method, which is now codified. It's not just an order, an FAA order, but it's now codified. The FERC, the 80% first time pass rate with 5 applicants in the first, in 2 years, or being a check airman, or the other one, which is by duties and responsibilities, which is the way I typically renew mine because I regularly uh, um, uh, um, evaluating pilots, and that's one of the things that you can renew with. So, because I'm an examiner and I'm regularly evaluating pilots, I can renew it that way. But so anyway, so I don't know exactly what to expect, except that sometime in December of 26 or January of 27, I will reach the end of my recency experience end date. But for those that are still watching this, that we haven't put you to sleep yet, and if you are a CFI, I guarantee you, this is going to cause some problems. I've talked to my friends up at AOPA, and they're getting inundated with telephone calls about this. And I talked to my managing specialist at the local FISDO, and they're getting questions about it that they can't answer with absolute confidence right this minute. They will be. able
We're
to do that.
basically waiting for an interpretation to come from somebody at the FAA in writing saying, "This is what we meant." And eventually that will come around. That's a great example though. My CFI, it will expire 10/26. That will be my recency of experience date. That's in my I have the date on it because my renewal was October. So you're cooler than me. Once again, you're going to get the new certificate before I do. But yeah, I mean, we just got to keep track of these things. And it's okay not to know because not all this stuff is obvious. But you made an interesting point before, and I'm going to very glibly tie this all up right here so we don't go
Oh, you're
into a
so good.
third
You're
hour.
so good.
But you made a really good point about having the 2024 FARs right there in book form, and that's fantastic because it really is useful. And we will put links to all these new changes right in the show notes here. But I will tell you, one of the tricks I've learned whenever I'm at my desk, I don't use the book. I use the
Right.
Electronic Code of Federal Regulations, ECFR, and you can go there and it'll tell you right at the bottom of the page that regulation is valid as of today. So you don't
Yeah.
get caught up in that thing where, people do this all the time. They're keeping the FAR book from 2019 because they don't want to buy a new one. Well, there's
Yeah.
a lot of changes in 1 year. You add on 4 or 5 years, you got the wrong book. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's good for a paperweight at this point.
darn right. It makes you look smart. Just put it in the living room on the coffee table and people go, "Oh, that's a thick book. He must be really bright." But hey, don't forget to click the like button on this because we just taught you something. Admit it, you did not know these rules kicked in December 2024. Subscribe to the channel because if you don't, you might miss some of this stuff. And I'm telling you, this is the whole reason I have a relationship with Pat. He's smarter than me. I'm man enough to admit it. I just go to him for the source. He tells me stuff. And we'll see you next time. And I hope you have a happy Christmas, Hanukkah, whatever you're doing between now and then, right back here on MadPropsAero.
Hey, adios.